He had all the money in the world, but one question kept him awake at night. Do they love me or do they love my money? So he pretended to be sick. Very sick. What his family did next revealed a truth he was never ready to face. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Edward Stone had everything most people only dreamed of. Private jet waited for him at the airport. His mansion sat on a hill, shining with glass walls and golden lights. His name opened doors in boardrooms across the country. At 62, Edward was one of the richest men in the city. Yet on that quiet night, he sat alone in his study, staring at the city lights below, feeling more afraid than he had ever felt in his life. It was not death he feared. It was the thought of dying alone. Earlier that day, Edward had attended the funeral of an old business partner. The man had been wealthy too, powerful, respected. But as Edward stood by the grave, something had shocked him. Only a few people had come. No children, no loving wife, just lawyers and business associates. That image refused to leave Edward's mind. What if this is how it ends for me? He whispered. At home, his mansion was always full of people. His wife, his children, relatives, staff. Laughter echoed in the hallways. Smiles followed him wherever he went. But suddenly, all of it felt uncertain. Did they truly love him, or did they love the life his money provided? Edward had been married to his wife Helen for 35 years. She was elegant, always well-dressed, always polite. Their children, James, Clara, and Tom, had grown up with every comfort. Private schools, luxury vacations, expensive cars. Edward had given them everything. But had he ever tested their hearts? That night, sleep refused to come. He replayed small moments in his head. How conversations stopped when he entered a room. How his children rarely visited unless they needed something. How his wife often checked her phone when he spoke. None of it was loud. None of it was cruel. But it was enough to raise doubt. The next morning, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He called his personal doctor, Dr. Allen, a man he trusted deeply. I need your help, Edward said calmly. The doctor listened as Edward explained his plan. When Edward finished, Dr. Allen leaned back in his chair, concern written all over his face. This is risky, he warned. Not medically, but emotionally. I know, Edward replied, but I need the truth. They agreed on the story. A serious illness. Nothing immediate, but serious enough to cause fear. Hospital visits, medications, long conversations about the future. That evening, Edward returned home earlier than usual. His face was pale. His steps were slower. Helen noticed immediately. Are you feeling all right? She asked. Edward forced a weak smile. We need to talk. They sat in the living room, the space glowing softly under the chandelier. His children soon joined them, curiosity on their faces. Edward took a deep breath. I've been unwell, he said. The doctor says it's serious. Silence fell. James frowned. Clara's eyes widened. Tom leaned back, arms crossed. How serious? Helen asked. Edward lowered his voice. Serious enough to make me think about the future. No one spoke. Edward watched them closely. Their faces, their movements, their silence. In that moment, he felt something cold settle in his chest. This was only the beginning. And whatever truth waited ahead, he knew it would hurt more than any illness ever could. The house felt different the next morning. Edward noticed it the moment he came downstairs. The usual warmth in the air was gone, replaced by a strange tension that clung to every corner of the mansion. The servants moved more quietly than usual. Voices dropped when he entered a room. Helen was already seated at the dining table, scrolling through her phone. When she saw Edward, she quickly placed it face down. You should be resting, she said, standing up. The doctor said you need to avoid stress. Her words sounded caring, but her eyes were distracted. Edward smiled faintly and sat down. James appeared first. His tie was already on, briefcase in hand. Morning, Dad, he said quickly. I heard about your health. Edward studied him. Yes, it's worrying. James shifted uncomfortably. Well, you're strong. You'll be fine. He glanced at his watch. I have a meeting in 30 minutes. But if you need anything, let me know. Edward nodded. Of course. James kissed Helen's cheek and hurried out of the house. Clara came down next, dressed neatly, her phone in her hand. She walked over and hugged Edward lightly. That must be scary, she said. Have you told your lawyer? The question landed harder than Edward expected. Not yet, he replied carefully. Clara nodded thoughtfully. You probably should. Just in case. Just in case. Tom arrived last, casual as always, chewing gum. So it's true, he said. You're sick. Yes, Edward said. Tom shrugged. That's life. We all get sick. Helen shot him a sharp look. Victor, what? He replied. I'm just being honest. Breakfast ended quickly. One by one, they left the table, each with an excuse. Work, appointments, errands. Edward was left alone again. Later that day, Dr. Allen visited the house for a routine checkup. The family gathered in the sitting room, listening closely as the doctor spoke in careful, serious tones. We'll need more tests, Dr. Allen said. This condition can change lives. Helen clasped her hands together. How long does he have? Edward felt his heart skip. Dr. Allen paused. It's too early to say. That night, Edward pretended to sleep early, but he did not sleep. From his bedroom, he heard whispers in the hallway. Soft voices. Careful footsteps. Helen's voice drifted through the door. If anything happens, she said quietly, we need to be prepared. I'll talk to the lawyer, James replied. Make sure the accounts are secure, Clara added. Edward closed his eyes tightly. His chest felt heavy, not from illness, but from realization. They were already planning life without him, and the test had only just begun. Edward had stayed in bed longer than usual the next morning, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to listen. Through the half-closed door, he heard Helen moving around the room. She was quiet, careful, almost distant. When she finally noticed that Edward was awake, she smiled politely, the way one smiles at a guest. How are you feeling today? She asked. Weak, Edward replied softly. She nodded. That's expected. She handed him his pills with a glass of water, then sat at the edge of the bed. For a moment, Edward thought she might hold his hand, but she didn't. Instead, she stood up. I have a lunch meeting, she said, but I've told the staff to check on you. Edward looked at her. Will you be back soon? She hesitated. I'll see. The door closed gently behind her. That simple moment hurt more than he expected. Later in the afternoon, Edward walked slowly through the house, leaning on his cane, pretending to struggle. He passed the living room and stopped when he heard Helen's voice. She was on the phone. Yes, I know, she said quietly. If things go badly, I'll need protection. She paused, listening. I've stood by him for years. I deserve security. Edward's hand trembled. That evening, Helen returned home dressed elegantly, her hair perfect, her face calm. How was your day? She asked pleasantly. Lonely, Edward answered honestly. She smiled faintly. You must stay positive. At dinner, she barely ate. Her mind seemed far away. When Edward spoke, she listened, but not deeply. Her replies were short, careful. After dinner, she excused herself early. I'm tired, she said. Edward stayed behind, staring at the empty chair across from him. 35 years. He remembered when she used to wake up early just to hear his voice, when she worried over small fevers, when she cried at the thought of losing him. Now her tears were gone. That night, Edward received a message on his phone. It was from his housekeeper, Rose. Sir, if you need anything, I am here. Just one sentence. But it felt warmer than everything else that day. Edward lay back on his bed, eyes open in the dark. The illness was fake, but the loneliness was real. And he was beginning to understand something painful. Love, when tied too closely to comfort, often fades when fear enters the room. Edward decided it was time to watch more closely. The next morning, he asked the staff to leave him alone in the living room. He sat quietly on his favorite chair, a blanket over his legs, his breathing slow and weak. From there, he could hear almost everything. James arrived first. "Dad," he said, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling today?" "Not very strong," Edward replied. "I've been thinking about the company." James's eyes lit up slightly. "The company?" "Yes," Edward said. "In case I need someone to take charge." James sat up straighter. "Well, I've always been ready to help. You know that." Edward nodded. James spoke quickly after that about expansion plans, new contracts, and board meetings. Not once did he ask about Edward's pain or fear. When his phone rang, he stood up immediately. "I'll check on you later," he said. He never did. Clara visited in the afternoon. She brought flowers, placed them neatly on the table, and took several photos with Edward. "These will be nice memories," she said softly. She asked about the house, the jewelry, the vacation property overseas. "I just want to understand things better," she explained, "so nothing goes wrong." Edward smiled, his heart aching. "You're very organized." She laughed lightly. "Someone has to be." Tom came last, late in the evening. He dropped onto the sofa and sighed. "This whole sickness thing is stressing everyone out," he said. "I can't even sleep properly." "I'm sorry," Edward replied quietly. Tom shrugged. "Just get better soon, okay?" That night, Edward sat alone again. 3 children, 3 different visits. Not one question about how afraid he was. Not one offer to stay. But from the doorway, Rose appeared. "Sir," she said gently, "I brought you some soup." She set it beside him and adjusted the blanket over his legs. "You don't have to do this," Edward said. She smiled softly. "I want to." As she walked away, Edward felt tears fill his eyes. The test was revealing more than he ever expected, and his heart was breaking piece by piece. The next morning, Edward stopped pretending to be strong. He allowed his hands to shake. He moved slower than before. He let the pain show on his face, even though it was not real. He wanted to see who would notice, not because they had to, but because they cared. Helen had already left the house before he woke up. James sent a short message. "Busy day. Talk later." Clara posted a smiling photo online. Tom didn't call at all. But Rose came. She knocked softly before entering his room. "Good morning, sir." She noticed immediately. "You look worse today," she said, concern filling her eyes. "I don't feel well," Edward admitted. She helped him sit up, adjusted his pillows, and brought him warm tea. She did not rush. She did not check her phone. She sat beside the bed. "You don't have to be afraid," Rose said gently. "You are not alone." The words hit Edward like a wave. No one had said that to him since he claimed to be sick. Later that day, Edward pretended to collapse slightly while walking in the hallway. His cane slipped from his hand. Rose was the first to run toward him. She called for help, held his arm, and helped him sit down. Her hands trembled, not from fear of responsibility, but fear for him. When Helen heard, she rushed in, but only after several minutes. "What happened?" she asked sharply. "I felt dizzy," Edward said. Helen sighed in relief when Dr. Allen said he was stable. That night, Rose stayed nearby. "I lost my husband years ago," she told Edward quietly. "Illness shows people's hearts. Some stay, some run." Edward swallowed hard. He looked at her and realized something painful but clear. The one who cared most for him was not family by blood. And that truth would soon change everything. Edward knew the truth was almost complete. He asked Dr. Allen to increase the seriousness of the illness. More visits, more warning signs, more fear. The kind of fear that reveals what people hide in their hearts. That evening, Edward stayed in his room, the door slightly open. Helen's voice floated from the hallway. "This can't go on," she said in a low tone. "Everything is uncertain." "We need control," James replied. "The company can't wait," Clara added softly. "If anything happens suddenly, we'll be unprepared." No one mentioned Edward's comfort. No one asked how he felt. Later, Helen entered his room with a forced smile. "The doctor says things could change quickly," she said. We should talk about arrangements. Arrangements? Edward asked weakly. Yes, she continued. The will, the assets. Just to protect everyone. Edward nodded slowly. Of course. That night, Rose brought him dinner. You didn't eat much today, she noticed. I had no appetite, Edward replied. She sat beside him quietly. Sir, she said after a moment. No matter what happens, your life mattered. You helped many people. You are not forgotten. Tears filled Edward's eyes. After she left, Edward reached for his phone and opened a hidden folder. Recordings, notes, dates, conversations. He had written everything down. Every word, every reaction, every silence. The test was over. What remained was the hardest part. The next morning, the message to his family was simple. Family meeting. Important. Helen arrived first, dressed carefully, her face calm but tense. James came next, already on his phone. Clara followed, whispering to someone before ending her call. Tom arrived last, looking annoyed. Rose stood quietly near the door. Edward entered slowly, supported by his cane. He looked weak, fragile, nothing like the powerful man they all knew. I don't have much strength, Edward said, his voice low. So I'll speak quickly. Everyone leaned forward. I've been unwell for weeks, he continued. And during that time I learned many things. Helen reached for his hand. He gently pulled away. I learned who stays when fear enters the room, Edward said. And who plans ahead instead. James shifted in his seat. Clara frowned. What do you mean, Dad? She asked. Edward took a deep breath. The illness was not real. Silence exploded. What? Helen gasped. You lied. Tom asked sharply. I tested you, Edward said calmly, because I needed the truth. Anger filled the room. That's cruel, Helen said. Unforgivable. Edward nodded. Perhaps, but honesty often hurts. He turned toward Rose. She stayed, he said. When others counted time and money. Helen's face hardened. Edward straightened slightly. I have changed my will. The room froze. I will give my wealth to those who showed love, not expectation. James stood up. You can't do this. I already have, Edward replied. Rose looked shocked. Sir, I don't understand. I didn't do anything special. Edward looked at her with gentle eyes. You did everything that mattered. He turned back to his family. I did not pretend to be sick because I hate you, he said calmly. I did it because I was afraid. Afraid that when my time truly comes, I would be surrounded by money but not love. Helen's voice broke. I was scared too. Edward nodded. Fear shows us who we really are. He explained the changes clearly. His wife and children would still be provided for. Homes, monthly support, security. But control of the company and most of his wealth would go into a foundation. Rose would lead it with trusted professionals. This money will help people who care without asking what they will gain, Edward said. Tears filled Clara's eyes. We failed you. Yes, Edward replied gently. But failure can teach if you allow it. The weeks that followed were quiet. The family changed, not immediately, not perfectly, but slowly. Helen began to visit Edward without her phone. James stayed longer, listening instead of talking. Clara stopped asking questions about money. Tom apologized one evening, his voice low and unsure. Rose remained the same, kind, steady, present. One afternoon, Edward sat in the garden, sunlight warming his face. Rose stood beside him, watering the flowers. You're smiling, she noticed. I feel lighter, Edward said. The truth does that. He looked around his home, not as a fortress of wealth, but as a place of lessons learned. Edward Stone was still a billionaire. But more importantly, he was no longer alone.